Coming up on Chopper's Politics.
You could hear the chatter from picked up on the microphones when he sat down going, nailed it. Well done, Rishi.
Yeah.
And I thought the support from his colleagues was pretty telling.
Hello, I'm Christopher Hope, the Telegraph Chief Political Correspondent, and welcome to Chopper's Politics. I'm back in my favourite haunt, the Red Lion pub, just across the road from the Houses of Parliament. It's a bit quieter than normal, fewer people are here. Anyway, the magic money tree Theresa May wasn't able to find in 2007 is back in Westminster. It's not a tree now, it's a bloody forest. Chancellor Rishi Sunak has pledged £30 billion to boost the UK economy. That's of your money, and that's just for the coronavirus shock. It wasn't an easy job. He had to hastily rewrite the budget to deal with the coronavirus outbreak, and don't forget, he only became Chancellor just over a month ago. Wow. This was undeniably the coronavirus budget. But where exactly will all that money go? And more importantly, where will it come from? Which departments might feel the pinch? And will the budget so focused on the present stand the test of time? Well, to help me answer those questions and many more, I'm joined by Boris Johnson's favourite economist, Dr. Gerard Lyons. And I'll be asking Poppy Trowbridge, a former special advisor to then-Chancellor Philip Hammond, how she thinks Rishi Sunak fared at the dispatch box on Wednesday. But first up, to talk through the winners and losers of Wednesday's budget, I'm pleased to be joined by the new chairman of the Treasury Select Committee, Tory MP Mel Stride. Mel, welcome.
Thank you, Chopper.
Red Lion pub.
Wonderful to be here.
I last met you in your office in the House of Commons when you leave the House. That was last year.
God, that seems like an age ago now, doesn't it? Those were the days,
yes.
You know, when government was all over the place. But here we are.
Meaningful Vote
in
2
control.
was a year ago today.
Right. Yeah.
Which is unbelievable. You think what's happened since
then. I know.
then.
There's so much going on. There's so much uncertainty that time goes very quickly. And the days when I was leader of the House just seem like an eon ago now. But at least we have a majority.
Yes.
So we've got some control. You know, we've got some ability to govern.
Despite the buffering of world events, coronavirus and everything else, as witnessed by the budget. Now, in my hand, I'm holding the Red Book, which I know you know really well. I've tabbed up some of the modest tax increases. Corporation tax up 19%, worth $7.5 billion by 24-25. And this is the Treasury CGT on entrepreneurs relief cut to £1 million, worth $1.8 billion. Smaller things like packaging tax, red diesel tax, that kind of thing. Yeah. There's not a lot there, though, to pay for the amount of money we're spending, is there?
Well, this is a budget about spending and increasing borrowing. So you're absolutely right. So the freezing of the corporation tax rate at 19%, not taking it down to 17% as had been
and
planned,
now the CBI conference
is lobbing some money in, as is the change to entrepreneurs relief, which incidentally I think is the right thing to do. I know a lot of people will criticise that. They'll say it's beating up on entrepreneurs, but the reality is it's a relief that wasn't really working. It wasn't fit for purpose.
Down from 10 million to 1 million.
To 1 million, yeah. So it's not been abolished altogether, but it has freed up, I think, $1 billion or so a year.
Yes,
$1.5 billion or something.
1.8 after 5 years.
Yeah, exactly. So that's quite a bit. So no, this isn't a budget about laying on lots of additional tax, although I think the overall tax burden has gone up a bit. It's mainly a budget about borrowing huge amounts of money, not least for investment, because as we know, the government can now borrow through the markets at very historically unheard of.
It's what Chancellor Javid said in his leadership campaign last year, wasn't it?
He did. And I think that's the right thing to do. I do think that Rishi is doing that. We've got a long-term, as you know, productivity problem in the UK, so particularly since the financial crash in 2008. That is going to be partly resolved by well-targeted, and the emphasis has to be on well-targeted, and that's a challenge in itself, investment expenditure. And then, of course, there's a levelling up agenda, and that's going to need a lot of money around everything, not just roads and rail, buses and those kind of things, but also broadband and mobile coverage and all of those kind of things. So I think that direction of travel seems to be sensible. I think one of the challenges with this, though, is the forecast that the OBR produced, upon which the whole of the budget rests, of course, were set in stone about 2 weeks before the budget.
2 weeks last Friday,
at a time where if you turn, things have moved so quickly, we forget this, but if you go back about a month or thereabouts, coronavirus was contained within China. It wasn't a global pandemic as it's now been announced, and the impacts on the economy that we're now seeing coming through are a lot more concerning than they would have been back then. So I take a lot of the OBR's forecasts here, not quite with a pinch of salt, but you have to raise an eyebrow as to how accurate they really are.
What must Labour be thinking? You spent 2017 mocking them for their magic money tree. You found a magic money forest to pay for all this, haven't you?
Well, Okay, so I think the answer to that is that what Labour have always said, going back to 2010, is, look, there's a magic money tree. We don't need to tighten our belt. We don't need to get the deficit down from 10% of GDP to 2% that it is today. We can ignore all that and carry on as usual. And that's not what we've done. So I think the hard work over that 10-year period has arguably put the government in a position where they can now do the things that they're doing.
You're not worried about, this is borrowing now, which of course our children's children will pay for.
Well, if those forecasts end up being very much down the rosy end of the spectrum and we end up in a very difficult economic position and we start to find, for example, that borrowing costs go up and confidence in what the government's doing diminishes, etc., then we could end up in a rather tough place. But that remains to be seen. But I think, if things are broadly as the OBR are suggesting and the coronavirus ends up being a temporary hit that doesn't scar the economy, doesn't have a structural impact on the economy, then when that passes through, we should rebound and come back to the sort of kind of growth levels that the OBR are forecasting, albeit that, of course, they have tweaked those down a bit.
Of course, you're the chairman of the Treasury Select Committee now.
Indeed.
Will you give Rishi Sunak an easy ride then, given your view of this budget? Or what were the bits that you don't like?
I think, look, I said in my speech in the House yesterday in response to the budget, after the Leader of the Opposition, I said, look, I know it's a bit of a hackneyed old phrase, but we are kind of all in it together. And I think we have a sense of responsibility here, not just to go in and, attack things left, right and centre, to be constructive about it. So I think the committee will be looking at difficult questions around the forecast. Yeah. The Chancellor has also said that on the fiscal rules, he intends to revisit those and come back to us in the autumn and perhaps make some changes. And I think there we'll be wanting to reassure ourselves that, the economic rigour that rules should bring with them is going to remain. And he's not going to go off in some direction that's going to represent a further attempt to loosen things fiscally, whilst at the same time appearing to sit within.
So the big debate is, what will these new rules be? Will it be?
Yeah. So what he mentioned,
human capital,
exactly,
that kind of
human
thing.
capital. So do you categorise human capital as day-to-day spend, which is more difficult to control within the rules he's got, or do you lob it in with investment expenditure, where there's more headroom under his 3% of GDP rule? So there'll be a lot of debate around that. But I think a critical thing here is there's always money that's going to be shoveled out there, and it is enormous, okay, which is why Labour are really not knowing how to handle this budget at all. But the critical thing will be getting it out the door. So, in fact, if you look in that red book, the OBR assumes that 20% of it will not actually go out the door, which is historically what happens.
What, held on by Whitehall?
Well, just simply the process of trying to find the projects to invest on and getting the money moving. Engagement with local communities takes time.
A303 at Stonehenge won't happen.
It better happen.
It's been 20 years
as a Devon MP, it's going to happen. And I actually
20 years wait, then.
No, we're going to have our duelling and we're going to have our tunnel. Right. Don't you worry about that. But if you look historically at where governments have said we're going to spend all this money and invest, they typically get about 80% of it out the door. So there's going to be a big challenge there. Now, the second thing is you don't want to just get it out the door. You've got to get it into the right places. What does that mean? It means it's got to be productive. But it's also got to play into this levelling up agenda, which means it's got to help those regions outside of London and the South East. So what the Chancellor said yesterday was he will be reviewing the Green Book, and the Green Book sets out the methodology by which these investments are assessed. And there will need to be fundamental changes there so that the prism through which we view these investments is altered and skewed towards the region. And
moving much of the Treasury north is good as well. I think I heard that on the radio. I heard some reaction there from someone in Hartlepool saying, what a good idea.
It sends a strong message. Now, some people say, virtue signalling, and all the rest of it. But the reality is that virtue signalling sometimes leads to virtue. And I think it is actually important to demonstrate that, we're not just all London-centric. There's a world out, up and down the country, and we need to be out there. Yeah.
Now, while you were chatting away there, Mel Stride, I was just doing some calculations on looking at line 3 of the Budget Red Book scorecard. And in there is a line called EU contributions benefit from contributions no longer paid and custom duty retained. Now, that's really about how much money we send to the EU. Yeah. It's 14.6 billion by 24-25, £280 million a week. That's the net figure, not the gross figure, isn't it?
Well, that's right.
Now you're not 350 million a week.
You're speaking to somebody who is a reformed Remainer chopper.
Yes.
If you've
so it wasn't your number.
If you've done your homework.
Well,
so I was standing up.
You're Brexiteers now, Mel Stride. I wasn't going to go back into history.
That's why I say reformed. Absolutely. We are Brexiteers now. But at the time of the referendum in 2016, I was standing up in village halls right across central Devon saying, hold on a minute, this figure doesn't stack up.
Yeah.
But there was stuff on both sides of that. Anyway, we're not going to go down that rabbit hole. We've moved on from Brexit.
But the figure is there. I mean, that's £280 million a week coming back to the UK in 24-25. Brexit dividend, Mel Stride, can you call it that?
You can. You can also point out that there are consequences of the uncertainty of Brexit, and we don't have our trade deal yet, and those are headwinds that will affect growth, and in turn will have a cost associated with them. But look, we've got big opportunities going forward. We've got to make the most of them. And what's a great shame, actually, about coronavirus is that it's really taken all the bandwidth, and we need to be discussing and thinking
Brexit
about this issue.
It's the new Brexit.
It's the new Brexit. And I think businesses would say the same, actually. You know, the headwind that businesses are on is uncertainty. They've gone from Brexit, now they've lurched into coronavirus. I mean, this is a tough time for a lot of companies.
There's 5 people in the pub listening to this interview with you. One of us won't be here in a few weeks' time. Apparently a fifth of workforce won't come to work.
Well, there we are.
How are you feeling, Mel? You okay?
No, I'm feeling all right at the moment. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, particularly here with you, Chopper.
Okay. In here, there's no mention of social care, is there? That's a worry.
Well, the Chancellor, I think, did in this $5 billion that he's putting forward in terms of shoring up our health services, then cope with the coronavirus. But
I mean, longer-term reform.
I think there is stuff. Well, that needs to engage other parties.
Yeah.
And the problem with that, as you know, Chopper, is that social care, as witnessed in the 2017 election, where it all blew up in our faces, at the end of the day, is one of those issues that, you know, you want parties to engage responsibly, not try and seek political advantage amongst themselves, and to come up with a sensible solution. But it's going to involve some very, very difficult decisions.
Yeah. Now, listen, there's some good news in this budget, isn't there?
Oh, yeah.
I found it.
And 57, line 30.
A big issue of Brexit for some people, not a big issue, is the return of duty-free. Now, that's what everyone, the booze cruise. You get your Volvo, you drive down to Dover, go off to Calais, load up.
Back you come. Yeah.
Well, there's a long-term passengers policy consultation on page 95. The government is publishing a consultation alongside the budget to gather views on the potential approach to duty and tax-free goods policy after the transition period in December. Now, I've looked into this. They are looking at bringing back duty-free booze cruises.
Well, I think that will raise a glass from the great British public up and down the country.
It's a grain of joy.
They will set aside coronavirus. They will switch off from all that bad news, and they will focus on that. It is great news, but it's just a consultation. So let's see where it ends up.
Says the former Treasury Minister.
I know. There have been many of those in the past. I do.
Mel Stride, it's been great to have you on Chopper's Politics. We've enjoyed it. Do come again.
I would love to, Chopper.
And we'll have something perhaps stronger next time.
Absolutely. I'm up for that. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Now, stay with me. In just a moment, I'll be finding out why esteemed economist Gerard Lyons thinks Rishi Sunak's ambitious budget will last the test of time. Right after this.
Hello. I'm Ben Riley-Smith, the Daily Telegraph's US editor. And I've spent the last year exploring the scandal over links between Donald Trump and Russia for my new podcast, Crossfire. What I found was an extraordinary untold story that kept coming back to Britain.
The big gorilla in the room was, would Trump want to meet Putin? Would Putin then meet Trump?
And he said, and in any case, the Russians might use some material that they have on Clinton.
This is dangerous. This is really dangerous.
I've been tracking down those directly involved, from Washington to Cambridge to Belgravia, to try and find out what really happened and what it can tell us about this year's election.
So we're looking at the backdrop of Russia. We're looking at what they might be trying to do to our election.
Over 6 episodes, I will unpack it all, chunk by chunk, through the voices of those with direct knowledge.
Most people didn't even want to talk to me. I'm a guy getting death threats. I'm a guy whose life has been totally turned upside down.
I will tell you this, whoever it was, I hope they get punished for it.
That's in Crossfire, available now wherever you downloaded this podcast.
Right, I'm back in the Red Lion pub, and I'm joined now by Gerard Lyons, Chief Economic Strategist at Net Wealth Investments, and Boris Johnson's Chief Economic Advisor during his time as London Mayor. Jerry, welcome to the pub.
Hello, pleasure to be here. Of course.
With this pub?
I have been in it once or twice, but upstairs. But never for too long, I should say.
Yes. Now, you advised Boris Johnson on his economic policy. You know what Johnsonomics is, if such a thing exists.
I think it's evolving. Thatcherism took many years to evolve. I think Johnson economics, as you asked, I think will have to take time to evolve as well.
What are you seeing? What's your view of this document? What does it tell us about where he might take the country over the next 5 years?
Well, rather than talking about the individual himself, because clearly the budget also had the Chancellor's stamp on it, I thought it was a good budget. The challenge, of course, with any budget that looks good the day after is whether it will stand the test of time. My tendency is to think this budget will stand the test of time, but much does depend on how the economy will perform, because that will then feed into the fiscal numbers. But overall, I took away 3 things from the budget, and I thought they were positive. First and foremost was the overall strategy, the thinking behind it, which ties in with an overall whole-of-government approach to addressing the economy. Second was the very credible approach the Chancellor took to addressing the coronavirus. And third, the longer-term structural strategic investment focused on infrastructure. So 3 things: the overall strategy, addressing the coronavirus, and the longer-term spending linked to improving the state of growth of the economy.
Peter Lilly famously said roads don't vote, didn't he?
That's right. Yes, that's true.
So often the infrastructure is the first thing to go in a crisis, but we are now committed to spending heavily, aren't we?
Quite rightly too. The government can borrow very cheaply, and there's lots of investment that can take place that clearly will reap a high future reward. But putting it in terms of the overall strategy, the way I would say it is that we've got 3 arrows really for government policy. One arrow is monetary and financial stability, hence the importance of the rate cut and the other measures the Bank of England took. And the Bank of England has to be tied in fully to the whole of government approach. The second area of policy is credible fiscal activism. And the third area is the supply side agenda. And the Chancellor focused on fiscal activism, that's credible, and on the supply side agenda, although I think he and others will have to do a lot more on that supply side in the future.
And in layman's terms, what's in those arrows that our readers can recognise from the budget?
Well, to get a bullseye, you need to have all those arrows going in the right direction at the same time.
Yeah.
And not that I got too many bullseyes when I played darts. But I think the Chancellor actually should give us confidence that he can actually achieve the bullseye in terms of the economy. But the key thing is the whole of government approach. Everything needs to be aligned to actually basically pull Britain out of what has been a pretty low growth phase in recent years. Has to be said, since the referendum, we've still outperformed the likes of Germany and Italy. But overall, Western economies, since the global financial crisis, have not grown at the rates of growth they should have done. And I think we need to have a vision for the future. And the good thing about the Chancellor's budget was that he did start to outline a credible vision. And this is one of the important areas that the Prime Minister does well. It's about raising people's bar, basically. Let's look ahead. Clearly, there are near-term challenges and there are also longer-term opportunities. But the challenges very much came to the fore in terms of the second big area of this budget, addressing the coronavirus.
Huge there. I mean, what's your forecast with your view on the city of what kind of, what kind of shaped downturn we're facing?
Yeah, look, we can bombard people with data, but no one really knows. Uncertainty and unorthodoxy are the 2 key messages that come out from this crisis. Uncertainty, because we don't know the health implications and therefore how that will feed through. Unorthodoxy in terms of the policy response. But really answers your question, is it an L, is it a U, or is it a V?
Okay, an L, right. Start with AL.
Well, let's go the other way around, maybe. Let's go with the V, because Vs tend to be how these crises hit economies.
Yeah.
You have a downward leg of the V.
Yeah.
Difficult to predict how long it will go on for or how deep it will be. But then once you're past the worst, you tend to have a rebound, like with SARS, Ebola, other such crises.
That's how long that is.
So it's a recovery, down and up.
Okay.
The likelihood is that we will have a U. We go down, then we won't rebound straight away. China was weak in the first quarter. America, Britain, other Western economies will be weak in the second quarter. This will spread into the third quarter of the year. So more likely to be a U. And then we start to recover. So it's a significant downturn, but as the Chancellor said, it's temporary. The markets fear it could be an L. That's a slump. You not only go down, but then you stay low, either because the health response is not adequate or the economic response is not good enough. I think of the L, the U, the V, it's more likely to be a U. And I think the Chancellor was right. We need to have a timely, a temporary and a targeted response. And I thought he got 3 ticks for that for me.
And the canary in the mine is China. So because China are are ahead of us, we'll know what shaped letter this might be by watching how they recover or don't.
That's right. While I'm with Net Wealth, I'm also on the board of Bank of China here in the UK, so I have a close interest in China. The Chinese authorities have responded very aggressively to the crisis. The latest data suggests that they may be past the worst, but the next few weeks and months will be key. If genuinely that shows a pickup and the return to normal or some sort of normality in the Chinese economy, the rest of the world and the markets will take comfort from that. If, however, China, and I don't think this will happen, but if, however, China then had another downward leg because the health issues returned, a second wave, then that will make everyone fear it's more likely to be an L. So China is important, but at the same time, we can only control what we can control here, hence we take the measures. And that leads on to the third point from the budget, the longer-term strategic. People might be worried that the government's borrowing too much. Some people are worried it's overspending.
They are worried, Jerry.
They are worried, but they shouldn't be worried. And I think one needs to put this in context. Every budget and policy action needs to be addressed at the time it's taking place. There's a big difference between spending now and 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago. The UK's fiscal position is relatively good. Borrowing, of course, we could always say should be lower. Our debt maturity is very long, 14 years. But very importantly, the UK government can borrow at next to zero, less than the rate of inflation, and invest in many areas that can reap a high return. And it's all the I's. Basically, we're addressing infrastructure spending, investment, encouraging innovation, reducing inequality, and hopefully, if we get the supply side agenda right, it's about getting the incentive structure right. But I think the Chancellor was right to be agreeing to spend more and basically putting down the market for the future.
I mean, in the old days, the Tories would attack Labour for this kind of heavy borrowing and piling up debt for our generations to pay back.
No, well, again, one needs to look at it in terms of the context of where the economy is and the rates at which one can borrow. And longer-term strategic investment does make sense, particularly if you want to achieve levelling up. Where are the challenges? The challenges would come if the economy disappoints. People are worried the challenge will come if bond yields suddenly go up. But obviously, bond yields are not going to go up.
Borrowing.
But these are very different risks out there. More likely, with low inflation, relatively low growth, yields and rates will stay low. When UK yields start to rise, it will be a reflection in my mind of economic growth momentum picking up. And that's a whole different economic dynamic. But the big challenge is if the growth picture disappoints. But it's all self-feeding. And therefore, that three arrows approach becomes important. You need to actually protect the economy and the downside from this virus and try and set things up for the future.
Are you talking much to Boris Johnson now as number 10? Because, of course, you were lined up to be governor of the Bank of England. You advised him heavily when you were the mayor of London. You're quite closely tied to him on economics. You got his mobile, haven't you?
I've got lots of people's mobiles. I even have your mobile as well. The important thing, listeners shouldn't worry that I'm going to start going around reading anyone I know. I'm not directly involved with the government. I'm an independent economist, so I call it as it is. It just so happens that I think this budget is good, partly because I've been calling for many of these things before.
I'm not saying about your independence, merely if you advise him, if you're talking to him at all.
If the Prime Minister wants to read my articles in the Telegraph or other papers, then I encourage him to do so and take them on board.
And of course, Jerry, you've written a really good piece for us for the Telegraph's website, and it's online now. We'll link to it in the show notes. So, Jerry, you're describing your three arrows, but you are really saying here that maybe we are seeing the first indications of what Johnsonism is after George Osborne's austerity period into 2010s. Perhaps this could be the moment when we see the Tories becoming a high-spending party, high-spending government, but hoping the economy can match that and pay back all the receipts required to pay for it.
There's a difference between high spending when inflation is high, interest rates are high, bond yields are going through the roof, and high spending when the economy is weak, rates are low, and yields are likely to remain low for some time. International investors are looking for safe havens in which to invest. The only way this becomes credible is if the government can afford it and fund it. And they can. The one great thing in the UK is the Debt Management Office, which never gets any credit, basically has managed to set it so that UK debt has an incredibly long maturity, about 14 years.
What is that?
Basically, other countries have borrowing, but it's all 1 or 2, 3 years short term. So they're very vulnerable to basically what happens in the markets near term. Our borrowing maturity is 14 years. So that gives us greater flexibility to cope with the gyrations of the market. But also at the same time, the UK, 5th biggest economy in the world, post-Brexit, outside the EU, has the ability to sort of pull its own levers. And I think one of the good things about the Prime Minister and the Chancellor combined is they clearly have a vision to achieve not only a higher rate of growth, improving the quantity, but also improving the quality of growth as well. And that should make international investors willing to invest in the UK.
I was really struck overnight by the announcement by Donald Trump that UK travellers into the States are not banned from Friday, but EU travellers are. That's quite. I mean, I thought that was the first time I ever heard the US president talk about Britain separate and distinct from the EU, which is interesting, isn't it?
Okay, whether that was the right decision or not in terms of health, I don't know. But certainly in economic terms, I think that it's necessary to be thinking like that. The UK itself has a lot to be sort of optimistic about. We also have to be realistic about the challenges, and maybe the budget was trying to do that as well, sort of trying to get the balance right.
Gerard Lyons, thank you so much for coming on Choppers Politics. A link to your excellent piece for Telegraph Online is in the show notes, and I urge everyone to read it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, Rishi Sunak had only been Chancellor for 4 weeks by the time he stood up in the Commons this week. I once went the first 4 weeks of a job, not sure where the coffee machine was. But luckily, Rishi Sunak's got a team of advisors around him to show him where the ropes are, where the coffee machine is, and help him learn his budget and really hit the ground running. And someone who knows exactly the kind of preparation Rishi Sunak will have to do before a budget is Poppy Trowbridge. She was special advisor to Philip Hammond for just under 3 years until July 2019, and she's now Managing Director of Hawthorne Communications, and she joins me now in the Red Lion pub. Poppy, welcome to the Red Lion pub.
Good morning.
Are you familiar with the basement?
I've been here once or twice before.
Well,
I think you can attest to that.
I've been here with you a few times before. How did Rishi Sunak do? I mean, we're 1 month into his time as Chancellor. We're looking out the front page of the Telegraph, and he's holding his red box there, looking pretty proud of himself. How was he?
Well, let me say, I don't know Rishi at all. I know sort of some of his team a bit, but I was, without sounding sycophantic, I was astounded. I was blown away. I honestly thought he did an incredible job considering what goes into it and how little time he had to prepare. I thought it was confident. I thought it was calculated. And I definitely think it was a bit risky, but his performance was like perfection.
If I may, let's talk about that performance. What goes into it? What does he need to do? We're looking here at the budget red book. You know, it's whatever, it's 100 pages long or so, 120 pages long. He's got to be familiar with every line of that document, hasn't he?
And he's a guy who gets numbers,
a big deal.
Right? And the Chancellor really does have to get the figures. I think because of these moments, once a year, twice a year, however many budgets you do a year, you do have to be able to understand those numbers and sort of live and breathe them inherently. And obviously, my Chancellor, Philip Hammond, was very, very good at that, known as spreadsheet Phil, as you would likely want to point, fiscal Phil. He was very good at it, so that there's an underlying confidence with the actual material. And we had in office some good chief secretaries who also had that confidence. And Rishi David Gauke, Liz Truss was very good as well. But Rishi was chief secretary. So he would have been across all of these figures, certainly on the spending side for many months. So I think that combined obviously with some of his training in finance and obviously sort of public speaking, but across all the detail, he managed to punch the right lines when he needed to. And don't forget, every budget has a really, really boring bit. It's the OBR forecasts and the economic forecast figures that you have to run through. And it's hard to get through that without boring everybody senseless and having chatter sort of build up in the chamber. And I thought he calibrated it all really well. And he spoke for a long time.
He did, yeah, over an hour, quite a long one for him. I was there in the chamber looking down on him, and I thought, he carried the room, didn't he? And I watched several versions of Jeremy Corbyn's speech being passed along as it was rewritten, I think, because they were probably worrying, really, on Labour's side, what do we say about this? He's borrowing heavily. He's doing what we were going to do. Now he's doing it. I mean, Labour's got very little room to fight back.
That's a good sign that Labour are panicking and rewriting their response mid-speech. I also thought that the one risk for him, well, there are several, but one of the risks for him is that he's a young guy without much experience. And actually, I imagine there are a lot of people on his own back benches a little envious, a little unsure whether he's deserved of this position. And this was his opportunity to bring them on side. And I thought he must have had that in mind because he seemed to do that. And you could hear the chatter picked up on the microphones when he sat down going, nailed it, well done, Rishi. Yeah. And I thought the support from his colleagues was pretty telling.
Now, Poppy, you're amongst a few people who have been behind the scenes on Budget Day with the Chancellor.
Indeed.
On pages 2 and 3 of today's Telegraph, there's the full team line up there with Rishi in the middle there holding his budget box, and then either side 3 and 4 ministers. I mean, is that a lot of practice to get that lined up?
Look, how hard could it be to stand in a straight line?
Quite hard.
Well, actually, it takes a bit of practice. Don't forget that morning you've had 3 hours sleep. You've already been in for 4 or 5 hours. You've had to do a briefing to all the ministers about the latest sort of political lines to take in the budget. You're beyond exhausted by that point. These ministers have come in. They're ready to face the day. You have to line up in the right order, have a secret umpire's cue of when to turn and march off, leaving the Chancellor alone with his red box for that famous photo. And so I always watch for that secret umpire cue to see how well they've coordinated it.
Yes.
Of course it's coordinated, but they did a really good job. There wasn't too much rain or wind.
It was practice though, the holding up the red box.
You don't practice holding up the red box.
Okay,
I mean, that's not rocket
easy.
science. What you do practice is making sure everyone lines up and smiles and gives the photographers what they came for, which is a chance to get a picture of the new team, right? This is presenting the team, and that's really important.
We're fewer than 24 hours after the budget, and it's back today, traditionally, when it can start unravelling, Poppy. We're not going to go back over past glories or non-glories for anybody here.
Thank you very much.
But there's nothing in here that's leafing out here.
There are some risks. There are some risks, I think. Look, the overarching risk is that they've taken it all on themselves, right? This government's taken it all on themselves. And if this goes wrong, this bet on stimulating growth goes wrong, they have nowhere to turn. I also think on some of the tax measures that he announced, very welcome now. And if he hadn't gone full hog with coronavirus hanging over us like this, people would be criticizing him. But once you've done certain tax measures, they're very hard to go back to the standard.
Corporation tax not
or business rates, or they're very, very hard to undo once you've given a one-off break. So I think his next budget, that will be the challenge for him,
November
explaining how it was just a one-off, because people get very used to tax breaks very quickly.
They like those, don't they? And it's easy, of course, to spend. But the big worry must be for what is planned for the autumn. I mean, that's where everyone thinks there's going to be quite a nasty surprise there for,
on
middle
revenue
class,
raising.
Yeah, on higher earners.
The maths tell us that we're going to probably have to pay a bit more tax in life if we're living 40 years longer and expecting the same services. So that logic tells us that that's where our country is going. And certainly that's something we had to consider when I was in the Treasury. I know they're considering it with this administration too. I don't know if it's planned for the autumn. No one could possibly know. But I do think it's the new direction. And some of the traditional Tories who are very sort of tax cutting, I'm just not sure.
Anyone remind you?
No, but I think the Tory party, like every party, has lots of different camps. And some of those traditional Tory values are evolving and changing. And I think tax is going to have to evolve and change, just like the spending policies of the Tory party evolved and changed in this budget.
There's an exciting line here for Brexiteers, Poppy. 14 billion back, 24-25 from the EU rebate. You seen that there? That's £280 million a week.
Oh, it doesn't.
That's almost on a bus, that number, isn't
it? Look, we're still borrowing $1 billion, right? So borrowing is really the number to look at, not the rebates from the EU. And actually, you know what? Never mind any of the one figure that's not in the budget that I really care about is the growth figure. And this is just our best guess for now.
Particularly given that, all the figures were done before really coronavirus bit in the past 2 weeks.
We're sad. The growth forecasts were really, really
Where are we?
sad. We're like talking 1% here. And that's not the Britain that I sort of know and love. And so if this is a big gamble on boosting growth, it has to work. But it's hard for me to say.
It won't work by the autumn, will it? There, because we're looking.
It won't work by the autumn, but we need to see green shoots, right?
Yeah.
And look, it's the right gamble to take at this time. I think a decade of trying other things, and it was really important to balance the books, because then we wouldn't be in this position. But growth is how we must go forward as global Britain, with some kind of investment in our productivity. And this is what I think he's trying to do.
Poppy Trowbridge, former advisor there to Philip Hammond when he was Chancellor. Thank you so much for coming on Choppers Politics in the Red Line Pub. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Well, that's your lot for today. Huge thanks to my guests on this special budget podcast, to Mel Stride, Gerard Lyons, and of course Poppy Trowbridge. Thanks also to my producers, Elliot Lampitt and Theo Leludis. But most importantly of all, thank you to you for listening. If you liked today's episode, do us a favour and leave us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts. Thank you to Andrew and Unknown1010101 who did just that this week. It really helps other listeners find us. And one of those listeners is Owen Duggan from Ireland. He emails to say he's a regular listener who completely disagrees with pretty much everything that I say, but enjoys it anyway. He even says that I'm a class act, which can't be right. Anyway, do email us, chopperspolitics@telegraph.co.uk, and follow us on Twitter, if you don't already, @ChoppersPodcast. And finally, always buy your copy of the Daily Telegraph. Until next time, cheerio!